All right. Well, I'll echo, I think, what Kevin said earlier. Maybe Roy said it. I'm not sure. But we're darn glad Chris is here. So anyway, I am going to do this, and we will repeat. This will be something you've heard before, and repetition's not bad. It's a pretty good teacher. So I'm going to go through several things to nail down the things we've talked about. But the topic really is optimum productivity, or managing cool season annuals for optimum productivity. But when I was thinking about how do I break this down to something that I understand, I think I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to say, what's optimum productivity? And in our case, we've talked about grazing, we've talked about hay and haylage, and grazing and grain, but we didn't talk a lot about, and we will before we're done, using this as a way to get to something that maybe is more desirable. We talked about novel endophytes. You would talk about tall fescue, or novel endophytes, tall fescue. We talked about alfalfa a little bit. All of these cool season annuals give us a way to do that. And it's something that, as a forage specialist, Chris, is very exciting to me, because typically in the bad old days, the pasture was what you had to work with, and it was sometimes limiting. This opens up a lot of opportunities. So let's talk about the primary ones we talked about today: rye, wheat, and annual ryegrass. Great to see the crimson clover out there. But really what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to stick with rye and wheat. The using of annual ryegrass is kind of one of those things, either you love it or not. If you're cropping that field ever back to wheat, it's not something you're going to want to do. But it really is something that, and we heard all the good things about it. It's a great forage option. There are some lesser used cool season annuals. Triticale, which is a cross between rye and wheat. It has some very good yield characteristics. You don't get some of the decline in quality you get with rye, so it's very good. We can do oats, we can do barley, but for today, what I want to do is talk about just mainly rye and wheat. And again, some of these points are going to be echoed of what we said in the field. But let's walk through some of these things. If we're going to talk about optimum grazing, and we saw this out in the field, if you want to optimally graze, then we got to plant early in the fall, because if you want to get some growth out of the fall, and you saw it out there with the two different planting dates, you can see that Mother Nature bats last. That annual ryegrass planted really, really early in August got nuked with a dry fall, and we have dry falls. That's not a new thing. So we are always working there. But early planting is going to give us a chance of stuff in the fall. Strategic fertilization, again, a little bit of nitrogen in the fall to get things up, to get some growth, and then the payoff is the spring nitrogen and a little bit is going to do 30, 40, 50 units of N. Usually, what can you put out uniformly? What's that low rate you can get on? That's going to be good. Don't want to undersell the other nutrients, limestone, P and K, because when you need them, you need them. And I made that mistake yet again this spring. Somebody sends you a picture and rye is not growing like it ought to, and there's a place or two where you got a cow pie in the field and it's growing well, and you think, it's just nitrogen deficient. Well, it turns out it was potassium deficient because corn silage was raised there. So you go ahead and do the soil test, or at least consider the cropping history in that field and do what you need to, so you don't have you get what you pay. You get the growth back from fertilization that you need. We getting some good growth on there before we turn out on them is going to be good, because you've got more. You're taking the photosynthetic area away from the tops of those annuals, and if it's not very big, and you take most of that photosynthetic area, the sunlight's hitting the dirt, and that's not a good payday for you. We want to have sunlight hit green tissue. So let it get 6-8 inches tall before you get out there on there. And that's kind of tough to do, because you're balancing what? Rain, and the fact that these things grow like mad in the spring, because they're going to be not ready one day and overdone the next, right? But you're trying to find that right balance of let it get a little bit of growth on it before you turn out. Rotating is going to get you the payday you want. It's also going to help you control the hoof traffic. And that leads to the next point, and that is you got to have a place to put them when it's wet, because you're going to have wet times this time of year. You need a place to go. And we've talked about this, the gains on particularly wheat and young rye and the ryegrass with stockers can be just unbelievable. You just don't think you can do it. 2 pounds a day, but it would be stockers, small stockers, and they like it and they eat it, and it's a real payday potential for you. There, we talked about the concerns with grazing, and there are 3 of them. The bloat, which is the frothy bloat that can happen with any animal that's hungry, turned out on the lush, wet forage, and they're going to tank up, and that sets up in the rumen, and it makes it where that gas won't break down. They can't belch, and it causes them difficulty. So Chris talked about making sure they've had some dry hay before they get out there. That's the dead bang practical way to help prevent this. Don't turn hungry animals out there. And if it's really lush and it's wet, it's hard to do. But the drier that that forage is before you turn out, the less you're going to have, the less bloat potential you have. The nitrates is a different story. Typically, we're not just slamming nitrogen on these places, on these cool season annuals, and so that takes down the nitrate problems. Nitrates, as you're going to remember, is a salt in the plant, and it doesn't go away when you cut it for hay. Now, it does get chewed up when you cut it for haylage, right? But in hay, if you've got something that's overly nitrated and you make hay, it's there. It's like putting salt on your hamburger. It's there. But typically we don't see that in these, because what are we putting out? 40 pounds in the spring of actual in. You're just not going to have very much potential for nitrates to accumulate. Grass tetany, and the reason why grass tetany is worse with lactating cows, because they are turning over a lot of calcium as they make milk and lactate and produce milk, and they're mobilizing that actually out of their skeleton, and the fact that you've got a magnesium imbalance with their minerals makes it really hard for them to get enough of minerals turned loose in their body, and then they go into the tetany state, right? It's an academic chance that we have to deal with grass tetany. Good magnesium mineral is going to take care of that, you know. So I just thought I would mention these 3 things, because they're always a concern when you've got really lush forage in the spring, not limited to cool season annuals. I do want to make a couple of distinctions between rye and wheat that might not have been made as much in the field. Rye has the greatest chance to give you some fall growth. Now spring oats planted in the fall has a great chance to give you growth as well. But between rye and wheat, rye is going to grow more in the fall. It will start earlier in the spring. And one thing we didn't say maybe as much as I would like to is rye, when it starts putting up a seed head, goes to heck in terms of quality. You want to make something that animals won't eat, let it go fully to head and make haylage out of it. You know, it's good mulch, but animals will not eat it very well, and it's not digestible. So when rye is really a grazing crop in my mind, I was on a course that proves me wrong. You say something like that, and you go to a farm, and I went to a farm in northern Kentucky, and what's he making into haylage? Rye. But they're obsessed with, cutting it before the head gets out. So they're cutting pretty short stuff and making haylage, and it's good then. But let it get much of a head on it, and it's not. And it's the first to mature in the spring. Wheat sometimes, in my mind, is kind of like the one that gives you more of a safety net. Exceptional quality, high gains with stockers, and you can graze later in the spring, and there's much less of a penalty for if it gets mature and the heads start coming out. This is a graph that some of you in the room, especially the agents, have been looking at for 25 years. And even more, that's right. Because, as the thing goes up that we want, and that's yield, the things go down that the cattle want, which is digestibility and intake, or the things that get you paid. And so when you're looking at optimum maturity at harvest, this is kind of the magic thing. The head's just coming out. We call that boot to early head. I mean, that's on every forage test you'll ever have if you're a student Kelly, or if you're an agent taking an extra credit course, that's on. If you remember that, you're going to get that question right nearly every time. But when you look at wheat, certainly boot to early head is good, but wheat and some of the other cool season annuals will start to accumulate starch in the head, and so the quality actually is real high at boot to early head, and as the head sticks up, it goes down. But when the carbohydrates start going back in the head, the digestibility comes back up because of the starch in the head. The fiber is more stiff and you get less good out of the stem, but you're getting payback in the head and it's still palatable with wheat. Now rye, on the other hand, this will be on the test too, by the way. Rye, just early boot or just don't, because it's really, really, the energy drops, the digestibility drops, and I think the palatability drops quite a lot as the head sticks out. Soil Fertility made this point. Just do the soil test, put the stuff on that you need, but nitrogen management's how you manage that flush of growth and try to, if you need the grazing in the spring, and that's something else you've got to keep in mind in the springtime is what else is going on, because in 3 weeks, maybe 3.5, everything else is going to be growing like crazy. So how much do you need? But nitrogen can help you kind of manage that growth rate as well. When you talk about hay, you talked about this, and there are poor curing conditions in the spring, and these are oftentimes very heavy, high yielding crops, which is good. Mow early in the day to give you more sunlight to capture. We talked about leaving the swath wide to capture more sun, and we also talk about the mower conditioner. This morning we heard two different things. We talked about the mower conditioner to crush the stems, and Ernest talked about leaving the stems uncrushed because of the photosynthesis that might go on in that cut-off plant. I think probably if you did a 20-year study, you lose more to rain due to not conditioning a stem as opposed to the quality gain you would get from not conditioning a stem. I think that anything we can do to get that hay up faster is something we ought to be looking at. Weather damage is quite significant when it rains. And then, of course, it's just good practice to get the bales off the ground and under cover if possible. Baleage, I think you've heard this before. Mow one day, bale, and wrap the next day. And I even, it depends on the curing conditions and how thick the crop is. You may go into that a second day after cutting and still be able to be within the moisture window. Use that mower conditioner again and adjust it out. You want to hit 50-50 moisture. Now, I don't carry a moisture tester with me, and I don't carry a microwave. And, so how are you going to gauge that? Well, I know for a fact that forage crops dry very fast until they get about to 50% moisture. You just want them to be good and wilted. And I do think for cool season annuals, it's taken a full day and even into the second day. So when they hit about 40% moisture, which is getting a little dry, they kind of, the curve goes like this, down to about 40 or 50, and then it levels out to try to get down to true hay moisture. So one day's wilt is good. And it's do it by feel, but we make a lot of mistakes by going too wet. Baleage that's too wet is prone to not ensile correctly, and can even lead to clostridial fermentation and some of the things you really don't want to get into. If you're going to, and wrapping is what we talk about. This is an individual bale wrapper. I'm not sure what you have access to. We have a lot of people who go, if they convince themselves they want to wrap it, they go to the inline wrapper because it's faster. And so they can wrap and put a lot of plastic on there and get this to ensile and do a good job. And keeping the holes repaired will make sure that it ensiles well and you don't get many losses. And we want you to feed as soon as you can so that you don't lose what you've gone to the trouble to put up. If you look at grazing it out, it is an inexpensive way to utilize frosted small grains. That's a given. We talked about that, filling them up with dry hay and access to the hay at all times. The magnesium mineral, again, is your insurance against tetany. That's a good practice this time of year period. There's your 1 to 2 500-pound calves stocking rate we talked about in order to stay ahead of what you've got. And then supplement feed when you don't have enough, but getting in this time of year, depending on where you are, you may have plenty. And then avoiding when soils are wet. This is actually the rye in northern Kentucky that we were looking at, and you can't tell maybe from the picture, but there's no internode showing at all there, because I wanted to see if I could begin to teach myself how to see that internode. It was a lot easier to see the internodes today. So if you're talking about trying to graze and take grain, which is not done very often, that's how you know, is where the internode is started to come up down. They're still jammed down here. We saw them way up here today. So graze up to the first hollow stem. That's that internode sticking up. There's the avoid grazing when it's wet again. The yield penalty, interestingly enough, varies quite a lot. And I looked at Oklahoma data because they graze it a lot, and Oklahoma's a lot drier than we are, but they had 13 years worth of data. 3 years out of 13, they saw no yield loss. In fact, they had showed a little yield bump when they grazed it as opposed to not. 10 out of 13, they saw anywhere from 7% loss to 20% loss in yield. If you read our literature from 15 years ago about the grazing and trying to graze and take grain, it wasn't as kind as the Oklahoma data. So in terms of can you do it? Yep, yes you can. How much might you lose? Maybe a little, maybe a lot. It depends on the year and how well you do pulling off before the stems elongate and the wet soils get you every time. The last point I want to make is the fact that this opens up a wealth of options to us. It lets us do, when we can go through the cool season annuals, we can go through and eliminate toxic tall fescue if we want to by a fall application of Roundup or late summer. We can deal with other problem perennial weeds. We can rotate through summer annual grasses and help ourselves there. We can then be in good shape to fall seed something better. Orchard grass clover, orchard grass alfalfa, or just plain old orchard grass, or novel tall fescue. All those things are options to us. And we could even go back through a cool season annual and put yourself in position to put alfalfa in the spring. It's just one of those ways to keep on to improve your productivity by the use of these cool season annuals. So, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, they should be full before you put them in, right, Jimmy? I got that.
Well, and that's the principle, is that let them go in there and get a little bit of that, and it helps have a good mat in the rumen so that you don't get this really, really lush, foamy mass of protein, which is what happens with this really good stuff. It helps break that up and lets them belch. And if they can't belch, then they got a problem. But you just got to place back. You got to bale wherever you were feeding hay, and you're turning them in. Make sure they can get back to that hay.
Yeah, it's like self-medicating. So right. So if they're not feeling good, they can go to the dry hay.
And I've had people say, and I believe this, that once they get something green to eat, they're not likely to go back to most hay. But it does help if they get a little to help deal with that bloat. Helps. It's an insurance thing.
Yeah, and you want to don't put the fescue hay out that you made on Independence Day. You want a dry hay that's hot, that they'll actually eat. Some of the hay that we make is not real palatable. Any other questions for Dr. Henning? Let's thank Dr. Henning. I think what we're going to do now is